Hey, this is Canadian Taxpayers Federation podcast. I'm Chris Sims. I'm the Alberta director of the CTF. I'm here with my friend, Franco Terrazzano. He's holding down the fort for us in Ottawa. So Franco, earlier this morning, you and I were talking on the phone about pay raises when it comes to the government. And when we were talking about the tale of two pandemics, right? There's the so-called government sector employees, and there's the rest of us, the working stiffs in the private sector. Paint a picture for us. How different was the pandemic when it comes to pay hikes, bonuses, all that jazz?
Oh, I mean, well, look, private sector, so many people took pay cuts. So many people lost their jobs. So many people even may have lost their business for good. And of course, government was protected behind those golden gates. But let me really illustrate the point with a crazy story that we dug up. It turns out the government spent $1.6 billion on overtime between 2019 and 2021, which is already a crazy, huge amount. But when we dug into what the departments were spending, check out some of these notable OT expenditures from some of the departments. Elections Canada spent $1.4 million on overtime in 2020. 2020, there was no election. Why was Elections Canada spending that much time, that much money on overtime? Here's another one. The House of Commons and the Senate spent $13 million on overtime during the pandemic, despite Parliament sitting in a virtual hybrid format. Okay. How is that even possible? Exactly. The Governor General's office spent $1.2 million on overtime since 2019. Okay, yeah, what are they doing over there? Probably finding new ways to waste our money. Health Canada and the Public Health Agency spent $76.4 million in overtime during the pandemic. Now, they were probably busy, right? But here's the thing, that only accounted for 7% of overtime pay during the pandemic. And now here's really where you got to put that hot coffee down. Fisheries and Oceans spent $98 million on overtime during the pandemic, which is more than $20 million more than what the two health departments combined spent on overtime during the pandemic.
Sorry, what? Like $98 million at Fish? Fish spent $98 million, that department.
Fisheries and Oceans spent $98 million on overtime during the pandemic.
Did we save a pod of killer whales and nobody bloody noticed? No, that's crazy. Okay. This is going to get worse before it gets better, man. How and why did they spend that amount of money, and how do they decide where to allocate that overtime? How does this make sense?
That is such a great question there. I mean, the question that I immediately thought too, I mean, obviously after the $1.6 billion, just a huge amount, obviously like the crazy departments, like why are they spending that money? Like some of those, like the Governor General's office, what are they doing? But here's the other question that I immediately had is, well, what are we getting for all of that money? Okay. And apparently not much. We kept digging. So remember, $1.6 billion on overtime since 2019. Well, it turns out that the government was also hiring 15,000 new employees every single year during that time period. Okay. So $1.6 billion on overtime plus 15,000 new employees each year. But get this, federal bureaucrats only hit 49% of their performance targets in 2019. They only hit 46% of their performance targets in 2020. So you have the federal government spending buckets of cash on overtime pay, spending buckets of cash hiring new employees, and these federal departments can't even hit half of their performance targets.
Those are failing grades. If you had those grades in school or university, you would not advance. That's crazy. Now, when you dig into performance, what I was surprised by looking at your notes there is that there are departments where people on the real side of the fence, so for example, being able to afford groceries, being able to afford a house, being able to afford the rate of inflation right now, there are people on this side of the fence that can barely afford those day-to-day things. And yet, when you look at the departments responsible for those areas, they're getting bonus pay too. Can you break some of that down?
Well, yeah. I mean, we also saw more than $100 million in bonuses that were handed out during this time. Again, at a time when half of the performance objectives were met. Okay, so like in the private sector, If you don't meet half of your performance objectives, you get shown the door.
Yeah.
That door right behind me is what our bosses would be showing me. They wouldn't be showing me a big fat bonus check. But here, let's just shift gears really quick, because I have an example that I think really highlights the craziness that is going on in Ottawa. The Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation. Now, I know our listeners have heard a thing or two about the CMHC. Okay, so the CMHC is a federal crown corporation, and it gave its employees nearly $60 million in bonuses and pay raises in 2020 and 2021 during the pandemic, and while Canadians couldn't afford to move into a new home. And I don't mean to embellish here. Home prices increased by about 13% in 2020, and then they increased by another 21% in 2021. Now, remember, this is a federal crown corporation whose number one objective is housing affordability.
Yep.
So then why is the CMHC patting itself on the back, handing out millions of dollars in bonuses and pay raises while taxpayers struggle through a pandemic and when Canadians can't afford to buy a home? And Chris, the reason that our listeners know about the CMHC is because this is the same organization that took our tax dollars, $250,000, to fund a report that recommends a brand new home tax, and then spent another $200,000 trying to understand the relevance of the report.
Yeah, exactly. And we're seeing similar stuff too, through all that work you guys are doing there at the Ottawa office on things like dairy, right? The dairy executives handing themselves pay raises, and Bank of Canada, it sounds like now too. Can you get into that?
Man, these are two crazy stories. So the Dairy Commission gave themselves pay raises and bonuses in 2020 and 2021. Now, here's why that's so tone deaf. I mean, even just setting aside the fact that this all happened during a pandemic when so many in the private sector struggled through very difficult government restrictions. But here's what else the Dairy Commission was doing while it was giving itself bonuses and pay raises. It hiked the price of milk in 2020, then again in 2021. Then it hiked the price of milk by an all-time high of 8.4% earlier this year. And it just announced another milk hike happening again, about 2.5% come this September. Okay, so they also received more money from taxpayers. And according to their last annual report, they received more money for taxpayers to fund the bigger salary costs. Okay, so you have these bureaucrats at the Dairy Commission that are padding their pockets with more tax dollars while they're increasing the price that taxpayers are paying for milk at the till. It's extremely tone deaf. And it's almost the exact same story going on with the Bank of Canada. Okay, turns out the Bank of Canada, again, these are documents that the Canadian Taxpayers Federation has been digging up. But it turns out the Bank of Canada, our central bankers, have been busy not fighting inflation, or at least doing the good job there. They've been busy handing out 45 million smackers on bonuses and pay raises over the last 2 years. Now, Chris, the central bank's entire purpose essentially is to keep inflation low around 2%. Now, if you've gone, can't say it with a straight face.
It's just so bad.
Because if you've happened to stumble into a gas station or a grocery store in the last year, you know that they've essentially failed miserably to keep inflation to 2%. So then why are they handing out bonuses and pay raises?
Just disgusting. Folks, you really need to dig into that. Go to our website. You can find all sorts of Franco's research and work there. And again, their key mandate is to keep an eye on inflation and to keep it manageable and low. I don't know about you folks, but I sure as heck am noticing inflation. Just give you an example, okay? I eat mostly meat. I try to keep carbs down because, I'm over 40 and they're death. So I eat like this salami, which was really affordable. For years, it was at Walmart for $8. It had the big sticker on it. That thing is $11.99 now. That's in 2 years, it's gone up that amount. And now you extrapolate, do the math, figure if you've got like 4 kids, think if you've got like a higher grocery bill, think if you have a lower income, that is just crunching into people's budgets right now. I used to get a call about once every 3 weeks on, hey, I can barely afford basics, or I'm upset about this and that. It's every week now. It's every week. And they're from folks who have just discovered us as a group. And I know politicians are hearing the same thing. Franco, you and I talk about accountability a lot. And I think I'm hearing a lot more desperation from people that feel powerless. They feel like they're not in control of their lives, to borrow a phrase. Um, how do we fight this? How do folks actually push back on this when they see pay raises and bonuses being handed out to unelected bureaucrats who aren't making their lives more affordable and easier? How do we fight back?
Well, step number one is politicians need to do their jobs.
Yeah.
They're getting paid a nice 6-figure taxpayer funded salary to keep an eye on all this, right? It should be the bureaucrats running the show. We need our politicians to keep an eye on all this, but they're not doing their job. And let me give you a good example. So at the height of the pandemic, and as the debt was surging through the $1 trillion ceiling, Ottawa agreed to new contracts for thousands of its employees for pay raises. And I don't know about you, we're both keeping a pretty close eye on Ottawa. I don't remember a single member of parliament making a stink about the pay raises that were being negotiated while their neighbors who are paying their bills were sent to the ranks of the unemployed. Okay, so in total, more than 300,000 federal employees received at least one pay raise during the pandemic and lockdowns. Not a single government employee federally took a pay cut during the pandemic. In fact, the federal government has no records of its employees ever receiving a pay cut.
Ever.
But hold on a second here. It'd be pretty tough for members of parliament to crack down on the bureaucracy when they've been busy taking 3 pay raises during the pandemic. So while you and yours have been struggling through COVID-19, through lockdowns, et cetera, your member of parliament has been busy giving themselves 3 pay raises during COVID, ranging from an extra $10,600 for your backbench member of parliament, all the way up to an extra $21,200 for Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. So, Chris, you started with this sentiment, but yeah, I think it's pretty clear that we've seen a tale of 2 pandemics here.
We really have. And folks, the CTF has been around now for goodness, 1990. We've been around since before the internet. So we were doing letter writing campaigns and phone call campaigns before email was a thing. And so, yes, I'm going to encourage everybody listening right now who has had it. Like, you've had it, you're done. Good. Join us. Go to our website, taxpayer.com. Sign all of our petitions. That's how you get on our standing army list of emails. So yeah, do the usual. Write your member of parliament. Write your provincial legislature, whoever that is, an MLA or an MPP. Tell them that you won't stand for this anymore. Tell them that not only will you not vote for them next time around, but that you and your friends will do a door knocking campaign against them in their riding. They'll listen real quick. Because if a politician is worried that he or she is going to lose their job next time, it suddenly digs the wax out of their ears. But Franco, I think we need to go a step further. We have that ability now. It's in formation here in Alberta. I come from BC, where we have provincial recall legislation. It's well past time, though we have federal recall legislation. And now is the time to strike. Strike where the iron is hot. There is a current leadership debate happening within the opposition party right now. So you get those folks to commit to opening it up to federal recall legislation. And I think more politicians will be more responsive. For folks who don't know, Franco, you can explain this better than I can. By having a certain percentage of people within a riding sign a petition to hold a by-election, you at least have the chance of firing your MP. Do I generally have that right?
Yeah, no, you've got it right. And here's the thing, right? If voters are the boss, if the people are the boss, then we should be able to hold our politicians accountable every single year, not just during election year. So, Chris, I think you're absolutely right. I think one of the tools in the toolbox that we need to push for is recall legislation at the federal level.
For real. That's how we fight for taxpayers.
Hi, I'm Scott Hennig, president of the Canadian Taxpayers Federation. If you've got another minute, I'd like to ask you to think about the one person you know that would really enjoy listening to this podcast. Do us a favor and do them a favor and send them a quick note to let them know about it. At the Canadian Taxpayers Federation, we believe there is power in numbers. That's why we've worked so hard to build an army of taxpayers who are ready to push back. And we did it because people like you shared our work with that one person that they knew would really appreciate taking part. Thanks for listening, and thanks for doing your part to make Canada a better place.